Good evening, everybody. Hell's Unicorn here again. And tonight I'm actually going to be doing something that I tend not to do a lot of, and that is I'm actually going to be following up on a video that I did with regards to a current debate that's going on between other users. Generally, with a channel such as mine, I like to focus on politics and other subjects either related to or distant from it in the abstract, and I deal with whatever's going on in other media. I don't really focus too much on what's going on in other YouTube channels because, frankly, a lot of the interpersonal interchanges that go on between different channel users generally tend to be petty, snarky, and mostly centered around ponage, and I'm generally not interested in that approach to doing things. I like to get to the heart of the matter. I like to deal with tangible, real arguments that can be delineated, can be discussed, and so that both sides can at some measure profit from the experience. It doesn't really happen much here on YouTube. Here on YouTube, it's who can please the bigger audience. And in keeping with that, the particular subject at hand has to do with Fringe Elements' current ongoing interchange with the Skeptic Heretic, who himself is somewhat of a connoisseur of the fine, albeit rather dull art of ponage. And this interchange basically began as a response on Fringe's part to a couple of videos that were put up by the Skeptic Heretic that were basically meant to pwn users that didn't have very large audiences and were probably ripe for the pwning, and all of the commenters that could come on could basically flood any opposition that either of these two users could mount via their own subscriber bases. As far as I'm concerned, the Skeptic Heretic is one of the more disingenuous users, Freudian slip there, that I've encountered on YouTube thus far. And I come to this conclusion based on the latest video that he put up as a response to Fringe Elements. I had predicted in my previous video that there would be a response out of him, and that I was somewhat sure that it would be an inadequate one, although I didn't really get into any specifics about what I thought would be said because, you know, I don't like to say things and then find myself having to eat crow afterwards. Generally speaking, it's better to save your opinions until they've either been validated, or if they haven't been validated, you just keep them to yourself. But when I look at Fringe's video content, and this is true with most of the interchanges that he has, I see fact after fact after fact. I see citations. When people request literature for which he bases his arguments on, he provides links. I'm not getting any of that out of the Skeptic Heretic at all. What I'm getting instead is platitudes dressed up in a snarky persona, and it's very off-putting, and I have a very hard time watching him, and I was able to suffer through the entire video that he put up. And I really don't want to get into a lot of the content because I think a lot of the content is largely, you know, an endless sea of irrelevant assertions, but there were a few things that I just wanted to point out, some things that were actually absent from that video, which I think should be necessary components of anything that is trying to be passed off as a valid response to some very valid questions. The Skeptical Heretic gave no qualifying definition for his little snarky assertion that he was once an objectivist and then he grew up. Fringe Elements points out very clearly, what does it mean to actually grow up? And I repeated the question as it was. What does that mean? Are we talking simply about getting older and that by default we get wiser? Because there is no real reason to believe that one necessarily follows from the other. In fact, I would argue that in many cases, people tend to get more closed-minded as they get older. They tend to get more set in their ways. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing largely depends on the ways that they get set in. But generally speaking, there is no way to universally apply this assertion that people grow up and that they let go of bad ideas. There are people who are in their golden years that still cling to some fairly horrid ideas. And again, what ideas are bad and which ones are good? We're not really given any kind of an opinion even with that regard, other than saying that objectivism is a philosophy for children. I personally happen to think that most forms of socialism are a child's philosophy, and I base that largely on the fact that every time I see so-called left-leaning anarchist or socialistic demonstrations, I see a lot of vandalism, I see trash thrown all over the place, I see violence. Some of it might be provocateur, but generally speaking, when I look at so-called demonstrations that are inspired by people like Noam Chomsky and the people that he associates with, usually a lot of private property gets damaged. And from their viewpoint, that might not necessarily be a bad thing, since owning property is considered a crime in certain circles in that particular mode of thought. I'm not specifically associating the skeptical heretic with that mode of political thought, but he definitely tends to be a little bit more geared in that direction than not. In addition to not really explaining what it is he considers to be a more mature outlook on life, I would argue that he's not exactly a shining level of maturity given the way he chooses to deal with people. He hasn't really given an actual complete representation of where he's coming from. I see a lot of moving the goalpost around. I see a lot of, you're stupid, I'm not, and that's the end of it. I might hear passing references or platitudes to certain thinkers such as Immanuel Kant. You know what, the skeptical heretic, if you're actually watching this right now, I actually have a little bit of a challenge for you if you're up to it. I want you to take, if you have a copy of the Critique of Pure Reason in your library, I want you to take it off the shelf, dust it off, read through it, and I want you to present me with a video explaining to me how anything he wrote in that book makes any sense whatsoever. Because the last time I read that particular work of his, it was a couple years ago. I don't really feel like going back to it because it's written in that really awkward late 18th century German style of writing where the paragraph begins at the top of the page and ends at the bottom of the page and contains nothing but a bunch of rambling and a bunch of meandering around hopelessly in desperate search of a single coherent thought. And nothing is really solid. It's nothing but criticism. There is no ground upon which to stand while you're criticizing. It's like you're falling in an endless vacuum of randomly placed facts, and at the end, Kant comes to this conclusion that there are actually two worlds, one that we perceive and one that actually is, and that's simply because we cannot know everything about actual existence, that somehow what we see is not an accurate depiction of how things actually are. There is absolutely nothing anywhere in the book that gives any kind of an inkling as to how we're supposed to know how that can be, how the actual universe is supposed to work outside of our own subjective understanding to it. So for practical purposes, there might as well not be an actual universe. And I think that Immanuel Kant all but completely destroyed the way that human beings come to understand reality. Unintentionally, I would argue. I think he was just simply a man that was trying to figure things out his own way, and he took a couple of wrong turns. In large part because I think that skepticism, when it becomes its own absolute, leads to confusion. I'll use Nietzsche as an example of this. It's a person that I have a very hard time making any sense of. A man who says that everything is wrong with the world and it needs to be replaced with something right, but heaven forbid he explain what that actually is. There's some kind of Ubermensch that's going to come in and show us the way to a better way other than this archaic vision of good and evil. We're going to get beyond the world of good and evil. What's going to be there when we get beyond it? No answer whatsoever. People are going to be empowered. Okay? Empowered to do what? And this is sort of an aside on the overall problems of philosophy, but this kind of gets into something else that was very much implicit and in some cases explicit on the Skeptical Heretics video and the other ones that he made previously. He is assuming, he's basically staring down from his, down his nose at everybody else he disagrees with and says, you don't understand what philosophy actually is. You know something? Put your money where your mouth is. You explain to us what you think philosophy is, what real philosophy is. You say you've read A, B, C, and D, and that these are more valid representations of philosophy than Ayn Rand or people that are associated with the Ron Paul campaign or people that are tied in with the Austrian School of Economics. You know something? Explain yourself. Okay? Get on that pitiful excuse of a channel that you have, put together an actual video that goes longer than 3 to 5 minutes, and explain to me what the heck we poor, ignorant little plebeians are supposed to be getting out of philosophy, because apparently, according to you, we're not getting it right. Anyway, I'm going to close off this rant by getting into the last minute of the Skeptical Heretics' response to Fringe Elements. And this has to do with something that I have long been annoyed by and something that I think is very important, something that really needs to be addressed. And that's this ongoing dilemma of political correctness corrupting any kind of rational debate on any topic whatsoever. It's well known to most people on YouTube that knows Ryan, aka Fringe Elements, the Confederal Socialist, and so on and so forth, that he has a past. He was brought up in a Baptist family, that is my understanding, and that he's held views that are very controversial, and there may be, to an extent, some echoes of those views still in his philosophy. And at the end of the Skeptical Heretics video, he basically said, you know something? You think I'm a shitty person, which he didn't say. He said that it was his opinion that most people, or people that he's known, who come into objectivism and then come out of it, tend to be shitty people. You were included that list only because you elected to include yourself into that list by mentioning that you were previously an objectivist, and that throughout the course of most of the videos I've seen of you, you've acted like a shitty person to other people. Constantly yell at them, constantly saying, I'm right and you're wrong, fuck you, and so on and so forth. It's no way to carry yourself in a discussion, man. Something you need to work on. But instead of maybe saying to Ryan, you know, you're a little bit off on this, I'm not actually a shitty person. I did come out of objectivism, but you know something? I want to actually have a rational discussion with you. You pretty much did the opposite and you proved his point. And you basically accused him of being a quote-unquote closeted white nationalist. White nationalism is a dirty word in political discourse on YouTube because everybody's, you know, racially tolerant and all the races are equal and blah, 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 yada, yada. I personally do not identify myself as a white nationalist, and I don't believe that there's any inherent superiority within the races. I do believe in racial distinctions, and as a personal preference, I don't tend to date women that are outside of my race. I'm a Caucasian, and generally my preference is for Caucasian women. It's just the way it is. It's not that I dislike women of other races or think that they're any less beautiful within the subjective standard of beauty, but it is what it is. I don't feel ashamed about that. And there have been people on YouTube whom, when I've shared this with them, have said that I should feel ashamed about it. To which I respond, sorry, it's not going to happen. If I don't want to do it, I'm not going to do it. And you're not going to convince me through some sort of guilt trip that that's the way I should think. Fringe Elements has gotten into this particular subject with a couple of other channels. And he cites studies to back up his claims that there are distinctions between the races. He has always kept it within the frame of his arguments that there is differentiation between individuals, and that in fact his general drive is that any kind of racial egalitarianism, because it doesn't exist in actual reality, is by necessity followed by disparities in how the government treats different groups of people. And we can see that through things such as racial quotas, affirmative action, and all that. And that's stuff I don't support for a number of reasons. Probably the biggest one being that the people that are the so-called beneficiaries of these programs never really advance in the ways that count. How is simply getting a job going to benefit someone who doesn't have the necessary intellectual tools to do that job? It is far better that these individuals be given the opportunity to educate themselves to their fullest potential. And if their potential is less than another person, there is no great injury to the whole human race that needs to be addressed. It's simply one individual reaching his potential, and it's not going to be the same as the next person. If we were all doctors and lawyers, nobody would be preparing our dinners, nobody would be building houses. I know that in the past, Fringe Elements, under his other account personas, has done some things that I would consider to be questionable. I'm not going to get into any of the specifics because I don't think it's relevant to the conversation. And that is actually my chief objection to this being brought up. Ryan may actually be a closeted white nationalist for all I know. I haven't asked him. But that has no relevance whatsoever to the topic that was being discussed. There was nothing at all in the discussion that led me to believe that a comment regarding a person's view on race was valid, even from a tangential argument in the context of discussing philosophy as it was being discussed, discussing objectivism versus collectivism versus market anarchism and so on and so forth. And to me, it just came off as really, really disingenuous. Par for the course for the discourse on YouTube, but that doesn't really change how disingenuous it was. To give all of you an example of what I'm talking about here, when I was in my early 20s, I was misanthropic. I literally hated the whole human race. I listened to dark Nordic black metal. I listened to bands like Dark Throne, Emperor, Immortal, one of the lighter ones in that particular genre, Burzum, Gorgoroth, Enslaved. All of these bands that are generally associated with Satan worship, misanthropy, and several other anti-establishment modes of thought that are actually very subversive and, at times, morbid. And I listened to other bands that were a little more tongue-in-cheek, like Beherit from Finland, and I even listened to some of the early material that was put out by Behemoth before they became purveyors of modern black and death metal and became darlings on Headbangers Ball. The fact that I would harbor hatred towards the entire human race would seem to indicate that my past outlook on life was far more hate-worthy than anything that I can think of that has been mentioned that Fringe Elements has been involved in his past. But I have a feeling that most of the people that are not of a conservative Christian persuasion that follow my channel, and most of the people on the Skeptical Heretics channel, would have as much of a problem with me holding this view than they would with Fringe Elements citing a few statistics that showcase disparities in the IQ test scores of people of different races. I think that that is a very valid discussion to have. What's more important, that the entire human race benefit as a whole, or that only certain people be given the ability to have some subjective state of fairness in relation to others? And what's more abhorrent, the entire planet Earth being without the human race, or the planet Earth being segregated either voluntarily or forcefully among ethnic and racial lines? What's more disturbing to you? The notion of us nuking ourselves completely out of existence? Or maybe that busing and certain other things attached to the 1960s civil rights movement were a little bit overreaching and caused more harm than they did good? I can't even have a rational discussion with most people on YouTube about whether or not the Civil War was actually necessary without being called a racist, a copperhead, or someone who supports slavery. I have never given any indication anywhere on YouTube or at any other point in my life that I can think of where I think that slavery is something that should exist. By the same token, I'm not a big war hawk, even when the cause is allegedly just and in line with so-called just warfare theory. I think that Christian just war theory is a concept that has been very much abused by people claiming to be followers of Christ. But can't really have a discussion like that. It's taboo. And this gets into something that I have long held about people in the broader YouTube atheist community, with exceptions, of course, and that is that despite all of the assertions that we are going to be free rational thinkers and that no debate will be taboo, we will discuss everything and we will come to a reasonable conclusion. In actual practice, that doesn't go on. People, particularly in the way that they deal with each other, is the root of the problem. This is where I differ with most secular thinkers on YouTube. I don't think religion is the problem. I think that religion on many levels can be symptomatic of another problem, depending on what the religion teaches. But the notion that we can find secular justifications for treating each other like crap and not owning up whenever we're wrong about something leads me to believe that man's inability to get along with his brothers is a human problem and not a theological problem. Not really even a particular philosophical problem. I've seen arrogant jackasses in just about every different school of philosophy out there that I've had the privilege to encounter. I guess what I'm just trying to get to here is that there is so much out there to consider, and so little of it actually does get considered. And this recent episode that I'm talking about is probably one of the more blatant cases of it. A case where a debate is unbelievably lopsided, where one person is doing nothing but making factual arguments with maybe an occasional sarcastic remark or a assertion of displeasure at the way the other person in the debate is conducting themselves. And on the other side, we have nothing but insults and condescension. Very disheartening. Anyhow, went a bit long on this one. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.